I always thought that my life was something whole, strong, like glass without a single crack. I had a job that I dreamed about back in college, a cozy house in the suburbs of Boston, a wife who seemed to me the embodiment of femininity, and a 5-year-old daughter in whom I saw the personification of innocence. Sometimes it seemed to me that all this was too perfect. Maybe that's why, when a crack did appear, it began to grow rapidly. This morning, as usual, I woke up first. Dawn was just breaking through the thick curtains in the bedroom. Laura was lying next to me, slightly turned on her side. Her breathing was even, deep, and at such moments she seemed to me the same girl I met 12 years ago. Then there was fire in her eyes. Her face shone with sincerity and love for life. Now, despite the external calm, something had changed. It was not a specific feature, but rather a feeling, slight, but still noticeable. Maybe it was her tiredness, sometimes showing through her usual smile, or those rare moments when her gaze seemed to avoid mine. Trying not to wake Laura, I quietly got up and went down to the kitchen. There, pouring myself a cup of coffee, I sat at the table by the window and began to think. At first, my thoughts were about the usual things, plans for the day, work, finances. But soon they took a different direction, and I found myself face to face with what I had been trying not to realize. Marianne. The name always came up suddenly, like a whisper I couldn't suppress. We had met a year ago at a conference. She was bright, energetic, full of ideas and passion for what she did. It seemed to me that her presence enlivened everything around her. At first, these were just rare meetings, work discussions that I considered part of the routine. But then our conversations began to become casual, a warm sincerity that drew me in deeper. When we saw each other, I felt like a different person, more alive, more involved. It was this feeling that became a trap from which I could not escape. Laura did not notice anything. She was busy with her work, with caring for our daughter, with household chores. Our life seemed stable, but this stability began to oppress me. Our conversations were limited to discussing practical issues, and more often I caught myself thinking about something else, about someone else. Laura did not even seem to notice my absence, as if we had agreed to live as if nothing was happening between us. One evening, when Laura was busy with Emily, I went out into the yard. The autumn air was fresh, with a slight scent of fallen leaves. I automatically took out my phone and opened the correspondence with Marianne. There was nothing special in her message, just a short phrase about meeting tomorrow. But even such words made my heart beat faster. There was more to those simple lines than met the eye. There was a hidden closeness that I felt more and more. The next day I suggested meeting in a small restaurant in the city center. It was a secluded place where I would never go with Laura or my friends. There we could talk about everything and nothing, enjoy the silence broken only by the clink of glasses and the whispers of other customers. I sat opposite her, watched her fix her hair, smile, and caught myself thinking that this meeting had become more important to me than I could have imagined. Returning home after such meetings, I always felt a weight. Guilt hung over me like a shadow, but I kept convincing myself that everything was under control. I had not crossed any boundaries, I told myself, nothing that could not be explained. But this was self-deception. Even if I had not yet done anything irreparable, in my soul I knew that I had already betrayed Laura. When I returned home, Laura did not greet me with her usual calm. There was something new in her eyes, something intense. She was silent, but her gaze was cold, piercing. I felt something inside me skip a beat. Her presence was an unbearably clear reminder of how far I had come. She asked no questions, said nothing. She simply walked past me, leaving a feeling of something unsaid in the air. That night, I lay in bed, listening to her even breathing, and tried to convince myself that it was still possible to fix it. But the crack had already appeared. It was thin, barely noticeable, but I knew. It was impossible to stop. Time slowed down in a strange way. Events that had once seemed clear and simple to me now became entangled in a tangle of contradictions. In the morning, I woke up with a feeling of anxiety, as if the world I had built around myself was about to collapse. And although everything remained the same on the outside, the same house, the same habits, inside I was gnawing at the feeling that something had gone wrong. After that evening when Laura greeted me with silence and her gaze seemed icy to me, she almost stopped talking to me. There was nothing obvious about it. She continued to do household chores, to take care of Emily, but there was tension between us. I noticed how she began to look at me less often, to leave the room more often if I was nearby. It seemed that she knew, but did not want to say it out loud. This silence was much more frightening than open conversation. It made me feel even more guilty. At the same time, my connection with Mary Ann became more and more complicated. Our meetings continued, but there was something nervous in them. She smiled as always, her voice was soft and calm, but I felt she expected more from me. Her looks became more intent, her touches a little longer than necessary. She didn't say it outright, but her silence screamed louder than any words. I knew she wanted clarity, wanted me to make a choice, but I kept putting it off, not daring to face reality. One day, as usual, I left for work. A new project was waiting for me on my desk in the office, which required my full dedication. But instead of delving into the documents, I kept returning to thoughts about what was happening at home. It seemed to me that Laura was hiding something, that her behavior was not just a response to my actions, but something more. During my lunch break, I found myself opening her social networks, looking through her latest photos, trying to catch something unnoticeable at first glance. In the pictures, she was smiling, holding Emily's hand, but in her smile I saw some kind of tension, a falseness. It drove me crazy. I felt doubts begin to penetrate every corner of my mind. Perhaps I was looking for someone to blame in order to justify myself, but I couldn't admit it then. That evening I returned home later than usual. Laura was already putting Emily to bed. The house was quiet. The air was filled with the light smell of vanilla cookies that she often baked with her daughter. I entered the bedroom and noticed that her phone was lying on the nightstand. A second, two, and I was already standing next to her, holding the phone in my hand. Laura never said a password. She had nothing to hide. But today, it seemed to me that there was something hidden behind this simple device that I should find out. When I unlocked the screen, the first thing that caught my eye was the messages. They looked harmless, short phrases about plans for the day, questions about shopping. But one of the numbers seemed strange to me. No name, only a long correspondence going back far. Reading the lines, I felt a cold wave wash over me. There was nothing obvious there, only hints, questions like, when can you meet? Or, do you have time tomorrow evening? These words could mean anything, but I heard something personal in them that went beyond friendship. I quickly put the phone back down, as if it were a hot coal. A lump formed in my throat, and I began to shake. What was this? Who was this? Fragments began to form in my head. Her late returns, her frequent trips on business. Those moments when she went off to talk on the phone, supposedly with colleagues. All of this seemed suspicious to me. But could I blame her? I myself was far from blameless. The next few days turned into a painful wait. I didn't know what to do. On the one hand, I wanted to ask her directly, to find out the truth. But on the other hand, I was afraid to hear the answer. A new crack was growing inside me, which was starting to destroy my image of an ideal family. I tried to distract myself with work, but it was useless. Scenes that I had created myself were spinning in my head. Laura with another man, her smile directed not at me, her voice full of tenderness, but addressed to someone else. One day, coming home earlier than usual, I noticed that the house was unusually quiet. Laura and Emily were supposed to be home, but they were nowhere to be found. In the living room, I saw her coat left on the sofa and her bag thrown nearby. This was strange, because Laura was always neat. Things in the house were rarely out of place. I went upstairs, looked into our bedroom, and only then noticed that the light was on in the bathroom. The door was closed. As if driven by some inner instinct, I came closer and froze. I heard a quiet, muffled voice behind the door. It was her voice. She was talking to someone on the phone. I couldn't make out the words, but the intonation was strange, unusually soft, as if she didn't want to be heard. A realization struck me. Something was happening behind my back. It was more than just intuition. It was fear, confirmed by what I heard. I quickly moved away from the door and went downstairs, trying not to make any noise. My head was buzzing. Everything was swimming before my eyes. Later, When Laura came down, she looked as usual, as if nothing had happened. I looked at her and tried to understand. What was that? How long had this been going on? Why hadn't I noticed anything? That night became the longest for me. Laura slept next to me, and I lay there, staring at the ceiling. 1,000 questions arose in my head, but I could not find an answer to any of them. It felt like my whole world was crumbling, layer by layer. Cracks I hadn't noticed before were now spreading across everything that seemed unchanged to me. After that night, I couldn't look at Laura with the same eyes. Her every step, her every word seemed to me to be imbued with hidden meaning. I began to notice little things that had previously escaped my attention. Her occasional glances at her phone, her rare walks without explanation, the moments when she went into another room supposedly to rest. These details tormented me like a splinter that couldn't be pulled out. And yet, I remained silent. Too much depended on this silence. Laura continued to play the role of a caring wife, the mother of our daughter, but there was an invisible wall between us. Sometimes it seemed to me that she sensed something, that her calm was a kind of protection. She never once asked what was going on, never tried to get me to talk. This silence seemed to scream louder than any words. Meanwhile, I had become a stranger in my own home. I could no longer find the same feelings for Laura and myself. Instead of love, there was some strange mixture of guilt and irritation. Every time I looked at her, I saw a reflection of my own betrayal, as if she knew but preferred to keep it to herself. And at the same time, a shadow of doubt lived inside me. Maybe she was guilty too? Maybe her strange behavior was a mirror of what I myself was hiding? One evening, when Laura and Emily went shopping, I stayed home. At first, I just sat in the kitchen, trying to work, but my thoughts kept returning to what I had seen on her phone. That number, that stranger she had texted so often, was haunting me. I knew it was wrong, but the desire to know the truth was stronger. I went up to the bedroom, opened her closet, and started looking for her phone. It was on the nightstand, like always. Unlocking the screen, I immediately opened her messages. This time, I was not so careful. I scrolled through the correspondence with that same number, reading every line. They wrote about meetings, about some trips. There was nothing explicit in the messages, but between the lines I read what I was afraid to admit. She was with him. The words, "It was wonderful, I miss you, and thanks again for tonight," rang in my head like a bell. I put the phone back, feeling a wave of anger and despair wash over me. Now I had no doubt. Something was happening behind my back. But what exactly? How far had it gone? I couldn't stay in the dark any longer. The next day, I decided to take action. I could barely concentrate at work, but I still found time to make one call. The private detective I contacted was recommended to me by a colleague. His voice on the phone sounded calm and confident. I explained the situation to him, trying to be as discreet as possible, but my voice was treacherous. He listened to me and offered to meet in person to discuss the details. When we met, I felt devastated. Talking about it with a stranger was like admitting my helplessness. The detective assured me that he would look into the situation and suggested that I start by observing Laura. I agreed, although everything inside me screamed that this was wrong. But I could no longer live in this uncertainty. Several days passed before the detective contacted me. His voice was as calm as the first time, but there was a note of tension in his words. He said he had gathered enough information to give me a preliminary report. We met in a cafe, far from my home, where no one could see us. When he put a folder of photos in front of me, I froze. Laura was in the pictures. She was sitting in a restaurant with a man I didn't know. They were laughing. Their hands sometimes touched. There was something in their poses that left no room for doubt. In other photos, they were walking in a park, standing by her car. In one of the pictures, they were hugging. I looked at these images, feeling a wave of pain and anger wash over me. But that was not all. The detective said that this man had been seeing Laura regularly for several months. He even found out that they went to a neighboring city together, where they spent entire weekends. Hearing this, I felt everything inside me crumble. It was like a blow from which it was impossible to recover. When I got home, I felt like a stranger in my own life. Laura was in the kitchen, making dinner. She looked the same as always, collected, calm. with that easy smile that I once loved. But now it seemed fake to me. Emily ran to me with a joyful cry, hugging my legs. I picked her up, and for a moment the pain retreated. Her laugh was pure and sincere, reminding me why I was still holding on. But in my head I already wondered, how will all this affect her? What will happen to our family when the truth comes out? I looked at Laura as she set the plates on the table and felt a determination building inside me. This couldn't go on any longer. I had to get answers, even if they destroyed everything. That night I couldn't sleep. Laura lay next to me, calm and serene, as if nothing had happened. But I knew that the mask she wore was about to come off, just like mine. We were both actors in a play that could no longer withstand the strain. I stared at the ceiling, remembering the photographs, the detective's words, and every little thing that seemed insignificant until it came together to form one terrible picture. In the morning I felt broken. Laura was behaving as usual, making breakfast, helping Emily get dressed. Her movements were smooth, calm, but there was a wariness in them now. She clearly sensed that something inevitable was brewing between us. I caught her eyes, fear in them, but neither of us dared to speak first. I hadn't planned how this would happen. At some point, the truth just became too heavy to hold in. Emily was in her room when I suddenly walked into the living room, where Laura was laying out something on the table. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but the words began to flow, as if nothing could hold them back. I told her everything. About my feelings for Marianne. About the meetings that began as innocent but quickly turned into something more. I described how the guilt was eating away at me from the inside, how I tried to justify my behavior, but could not. I did not look at her as I spoke. I was afraid to meet her gaze, to see pain or hatred in it. When I fell silent, an oppressive silence fell over the room. It seemed that even the sounds outside had died down, as if the world was holding its breath. But instead of screaming, bursting into tears, or unleashing a barrage of accusations on me, Laura remained motionless. I felt her gaze on me, and it was cold, piercing. It was as if she was trying to decide what to do next. And then she spoke. Her words fell on me like a bolt from the blue. She admitted that she had long suspected what I was hiding. She had seen the changes in my behavior, caught those barely noticeable signals that I considered imperceptible. But this was only the beginning. Laura told me that she herself had kept a secret, which weighed on her no less than mine. Her confession sounded like a death sentence. She admitted that for the past 2 years she had been in a relationship with another man. It was a colleague at work, with whom she initially communicated exclusively in a professional manner. But over time they became closer, and everything went further than she could have imagined. Their meetings began when I was too busy with my work and was already beginning to distance myself from her. She didn't try to justify herself. Her voice was even, but there was pain in it. She said that she knew it was wrong, but at some point it became her way of escaping the loneliness she felt in our relationship. I stood there, unable to believe what I was hearing. My indignation, which had been brewing for the past weeks, crashed down on me with renewed vigor. But, as it turned out, that was not all. Laura paused, and I realized that she was about to say something else. Her voice became quieter, barely audible. She admitted that there was another truth that she was hiding, and this truth concerned Emily. The words she spoke were like a blow to the chest. She said that Emily was not my daughter. She found out about it almost immediately after she was born, but she could not bring herself to tell me. The man she was having an affair with was the father of our daughter. Laura admitted that despite this, she always saw me as Emily's real father, because I was the one who cared for her, who loved her from day one. She was afraid that the truth would destroy our family. I felt like the ground was slipping out from under my feet. My entire life, which I had thought solid, was crumbling before my eyes. All my efforts, all my feelings for Emily, all my regrets about how I could have been a better father. It all seemed meaningless now. But at the same time, I knew that the love for my daughter had not disappeared. She was still with me, despite everything I had just learned. We sat across from each other, both devastated, as if we had been through a storm. Laura no longer tried to justify herself, and I could not blame her. I knew that our marriage was far from ideal, that we had both long been lost in our own delusions. That evening, I looked for a long time at Emily, who was playing in her room. Her ringing laughter filled the house, breaking the oppressive silence. I realized that no matter whose biological daughter she was, to her I would always be a dad. She was not to blame for our mistakes, and I could not allow myself to push her away. Laura and I decided that we couldn't continue living together. Our secrets had destroyed the fragile bond that held us together. But for Emily's sake, we agreed to remain friends. It wasn't easy, but at some point I realized that despite everything, I was grateful to Laura for the years we spent together. Our mistakes hadn't erased what we had. When I moved into my new apartment, I started a new chapter in my life. It was difficult, but I felt relieved. I continued to see Emily, took her on weekends, tried to be there when she needed me. She didn't know what had happened between me and Laura, and I hoped that she would never have to know. As for Marianne, I couldn't maintain a relationship with her anymore. Everything that had happened between us now seemed like part of the past that I needed to leave behind. I focused on becoming a better version of myself, learning to live honestly, without secrets and deception. Several years passed. The memories of that time still hurt, but I realized that the pain had made me stronger. It had taught me to value the truth, no matter how bitter it was. Emily grew up, and I watched with pride as she became strong and kind. She was my reason for living, my ray of light in the darkest days. And although my life took a different path, I still found the strength to forgive, both Laura and myself.